This is an interview with James W. Hicks about his activities in the West Africa Smallpox Eradication Project. The interview is being conducted at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta, Georgia on July 14, 2006. It is a part of the 40th anniversary reunion of the launching of the program. The interviewer is Victoria Harden. Mr. Hicks, you were born in Jacksonville, Florida on January 17, 1930. Would you describe for me briefly your childhood and pre-college education in North Florida and what it was like in the 1930s?
Well, as a child, I grew up in Depression years, and that had some differences to it when compared to today or at a later period. But it was a happy time in my life. However, at the age of 4, my mother died, and we were poor, but we didn't know we were poor because everybody around us was no better off. But I suppose during that period of time when my mother died, I suppose the one that's most influential in my life I was almost 5 years old, from that period on and into my adult life was my grandmother, my maternal grandmother. Now I like my paternal grandmother very much, but I only saw her once for 2 weeks, and because she lived in Vancouver, Canada. Oh. So British Columbia is a good ways from Florida in the 30s, so I really didn't know her. But my other grandmother was as close to a saint as you're going to find in this world. And
what was her name?
Her name was Elmira Fisher Brown, but we called her Big Dolly. Now that was developed out of an affectionate term that my mother, who died, called her mother Dolly. Well, that was just a nickname, but when my sister was born, the nickname became a name for my sister, and she was literally named Dolly. So now we had Little Dolly and Big Dolly. Well, Big Dolly I never looked on as any kind of the size associated with the name. It was just said in one swoop, Big Dolly. It was a name, Big Dolly. But I'm grateful for the chance to mention her name because she is the most influential person in my entire life up until the time I got married.
In 1947, you were 17, and you went into the U.S. Navy and served in the Pacific till 1952. Would you tell me about your time in the Navy and how it might have helped prepare you for your later work in the smallpox program and elsewhere?
Well, I enlisted in the Navy, and so as a a recruit, I had to go through one of the training camps. Mine was Bainbridge, Maryland. I came out of Bainbridge after 12 weeks, I think it was, and was selected to go to the Naval Air Technical Training Center in Jacksonville, Florida. So it was like going back home again. It didn't seem like when was I going to see the world, you know. So I went back there and I went through aviation fundamentals, and then I was selected to go to control tower operators. It was a specialty rate at that time. And what it amounts to is the flight controllers and control towers that control aircraft today. And so I got out of that school, and then I went on my first assignment, which was in Kodiak, Alaska. And I stayed there for about 1.5 years, came back, and then my next assignment was at Moffett Field, California. I was there a very short time because I wanted to get out and see something. Well, I made the choice to accept an assignment to Agana, Guam, which is in Marianas Islands in the Pacific. And while on Guam, I moved sometimes to Saipan, to Rota as part of the work. But I was the lead flight controller on Guam for the time we were there until the Korean War broke out. When the Korean War broke out, we took a large contingent of the men from Guam, and we went to Sangley Point, Philippines, and opened up an airport. We actually use those mats, those metal mats for runway. For a runway, we only had the one runway. And that was used as a support operation for what was going on in Korea. So I stayed there, and then during that time to get out, President Truman extended everybody involuntarily, and so I stayed there another year. And then when I left there, my service time, I went back to North Island in California, and again I was in flight control there until I was discharged in the January of 1952, and that's when I entered that the spring semester at the University of Florida.
So here you are coming back after long military service and having definitely become an adult at this point, and then you start back to college. I expect that your approach to study might have been different at this point from the 17 and 18-year-olds who were coming to the University of Florida. You ended up with both a BA and a BS degree and were chosen for the Hall of Fame and elected to Florida Blue Key Honor Society. You must have seen this period as an opportunity.
Well, I realized that what I was really missing was the fact that I didn't have a high school graduation or any kind of a high school diploma. That's what I'm trying to say. And I realized when I immediately got into training in Jacksonville, I was selected then to go to flight training at Pensacola, and I always wanted to be a pilot. I ended up being a pilot, but in other ways. So the next day was when I was to leave for Pensacola, and they said, "We were pulling together everything in your file. We don't have your high school diploma here." And I said, "Well, I can't produce it because I don't have one." But I said, "I passed all of your tests with high scores." And they said, "Well, there's a right way, a wrong way, and a Navy way, and this is the Navy way, and we're sorry, but we can't accept you." Well, that kind of bothered me. So when I got into the service, I took these Armed Forces Institute extension courses to get enough credits to at least get a what they call it then, it was equivalency certificate. So then Duval High School, which was no longer a high school, but it was more an adult vocational thing, they, with some correspondence with them, they literally gave me a degree from there, but I never had a legitimate diploma. So when I went to the University of Florida, immediately they accepted me because of what I had my interest in getting further education, but it was done on the fact that it was on probation right from the day I entered this school. Well, that woke me up a little bit too. I've got to do something, or I'm going to lose this opportunity. So yes, I made Dean's List the first semester, and after that they let me alone. So
what did you major in?
Well, I got fascinated with the whole liberal arts concept, and so my work on the Bachelor of Arts degree, the major was English with history and economics, I think it was. But then in the science, I majored in a typical pre-med course with biology, chemistry, and psychology, but I took physics as an elective in history and economics, some of these things. So what I could use on one diploma, I could put on the other one as the extra credits. They penalized me, as I remembered, I think 30 semester hours that I had to do over and above this being able to use one for the other one. But that's how I completed both degrees. It was simply my attempt for a broad education because I had lacked all of that, see, when I went into the Navy. So that's how I ended up with that.
You then, when you graduated, you began to work with the Florida State Board of Health. Tell me about being a VD representative with the Florida State Board of Health. You were in this co-op program with the Public Health Service, and I'd like to know more about the co-op program, too.
Okay, the Public Health Service, and specifically CDC as a lead point, with some states, not all of them, but with some states had an arrangement whereby you were an employee of the state, but at the same time your paychecks came from the federal government. It was the understanding that at some point in time, usually thought of as a year, that you would be tested and switched over to what then was called a program representative, and with a parentheses VD, because this was venereal disease control where these co-ops went in Florida.
But when you were switched over, excuse me, I just want you to clarify, then you were an employee of the federal government working for the state, or you were still an employee of the state government?
I was an employee of the state initially, but as soon as we took that test, they converted us then to a GS7. So then I was an employee of the Communicable Disease Center at that time, and it was a co-op arrangement between CDC and state health departments, and that relationship has existed, you know, all down through the years. There's always been that tie with state health departments and CDC. So that's what happened there.
What did you do as a VD officer?
Well, the first thing that I went into training on was I was assigned to a clinic, and they spent a day or two teaching me how to take bloods from the arm to do serological tests for syphilis. And I did that for about, and also tracing contacts that had been named during interviews. So that's basically what I did for the first month, and I think I was only there about 3 weeks, 4 weeks, and then I got transferred to a mobile team to take blood tests, and we used what was called sometimes a Kydell tube. It was a type of vacuum tube that would pull the blood out once you got into the vein. And then we used some called Shepherd tubes, and function the same. And what we would do is put a great big bullhorn and 78 RPM records on a record player in the front seat of a panel truck, and we would go up, park out somewhere under a chinaberry tree, and here people would come and dance and all that dust and all. And while that was going on, we wore a white coat, and we'd put Shepherd tubes in one pocket, and we would just walk through the crowd of people. I'm sure it wouldn't be allowed today. And they'd put out their arm, we'd take their blood, and so I got pretty proficient at taking bloods. In fact, I sometimes help out now in the hospital when they jug around for a while. I see they want me to do that because we did so many of them. I mean, so many of them. But it was some music played loud. It would attract people, and while they were there having a big carnival-like atmosphere, we would get all these bloods. And then we would send them off that night to the State Board of Health in Jacksonville, and then they would send the reports back, and we would do follow-up on those bloods. We were trying to find syphilis. We found a lot of latent syphilis, but we didn't find as many as we hoped we would of the primary and secondary syphilis, because it was through serological testing and not a physical exam. So I did that for, on that mobile team I was on there, I guess 2 or 3, 4 months, something like that, mainly in the Daytona Beach area and DeLand, Florida, inland some distance around Stetson University, that area. And then they needed a VD rep in Tampa covering Pinellas County with St. Petersburg and Tampa, Hillsborough County. So I was sent to Tampa, and I worked there for, well, from '57 to about 3 years. And then, besides those two counties, which I worked on a regular basis with 3 clinics, there was one in Pinellas County and St. Petersburg, one in Tampa, and one in Plant City, a strawberry capital of the world, about 30 miles east of Tampa. So we managed those clinics, both interviewing for gonorrhea and syphilis, but our primary concern was syphilis. And then if there was an outbreak in Naples or somewhere along the West Coast, so-called Gold Coast there, I would go down to Naples or Fort Myers or wherever and do interviews and then trace the people and get them into local clinics for treatment.
Then after you did this, you moved to Philadelphia, and you were doing the same sort of thing, I believe, in Philadelphia?
Yes, but it was altered a little bit, because when I got there, I found out that I ended up being, we had city employees as well as federal employees, assignees, in the same group in the VD part of it. And there was a senior federal assignee when I went there, a fellow by the name of Bill Hamlin, and I went in as sort of his assistant. And the reason they brought me up there, I think, was because I was having pretty good success with the interviewing technique, and I thought it was kind of fun. I went through school in Atlanta to do it, and they test you there, and I got a perfect score. So I guess based on that and my work later, I don't mean to be saying anything other than what happened, but I think I was selected there to try to rescue some of the failures in Philadelphia on interviewing. So I spent an awful lot of time on re-interviews to get contacts that weren't gotten before. And then gradually I evolved into other activities there.
The other important thing about Philadelphia is that you met your wife.
I did.
And married, and then moved in '63 to Raleigh, North Carolina. And by that time you were chief of the VD program and coordinator of the co-op program, which you had come up through.
Well, North Carolina had always been a heavy co-op training state, probably the largest in the country. And there were times when we probably had 40 some odd people in training there. So the assignee into the position in Raleigh, North Carolina, by arrangement, primarily on the part of the state, I think, if you inherited the title of chief of the VD control program, or VD program, whatever it was named. And so the state looked at me as head of the VD program. I was an assignee at the GS-13 level according to CDC. So I was one of those federal assignees doing work for the state and carrying a state title. And I stayed in that for about 3 years. I got the call from Billy Griggs and offering me the job in smallpox.
And I want to come back to that, but I want to divert for one moment and say you also adopted 2 children during this time, and you're going to tell us a little bit later about the problems you had in Africa.
Well, it was, yeah, I had a serious problem with one of my sons, but both beautiful young men who've have reached that age when they have families of their own, and I can't even think about them without filling up. I have so much love for my boys, and they're both doing extremely well, both of them with the families of their own. But my concern was when we had those 2 children, they said, well, you have to let them know they're adopted. They're not natural birth, because you got to have birth certificate, all that, to get visas and passports and this kind of thing. So my youngest son, Stuart, we didn't have the final papers on him, and they weren't due for another year. So that meant I had to get a waiver, and I made it clear to the folks in Atlanta that, you know, if I can't get clearance on Stuart, we're back to ground zero. The deal is off, you know. And by that time, I was wrapped up into the program and the excitement of it, and so fortunately we got a waiver that allowed the follow-up to be done in Lagos, Nigeria, where we were to live.
All right, now I want to drop back and say, here you are in Raleigh. You're the chief of the VD program. You've risen through the ranks and obviously done very well. And so when they were looking for someone to be the head of the operations part of the smallpox program in the regional office, you were a natural choice, I think. Would you tell me who recruited you and what they said? And
well, Billy Griggs was the one that made the call to me. I think it was June of '66, and he and D.A. Henderson apparently had discussed me and what I had done in my track up to that time. And you'd have to get more from them as specifically why they chose me, but I was glad they did, because it sounded, I had heard about the smallpox measles control program being in North Carolina and had known different little things about it, but it wasn't totally divorced, but we didn't have the communication at that time we do now. But Billy called me, asked me about the job, and then when I told him about Jimmy and Stuart, I didn't need to get a waiver, he said, well, he was sure that they would be willing to do all they could to help me in that regard, and I was grateful for that. And the leadership in CDC has always been that way, and I mean, in my family, and I've witnessed in so many other families. So I came down in '66. July the 1st, I think, may have been the official date. It may have been a few days off from that. And this was during that period of time of 3 or 4 months when people were being trained to go to West Africa. Well, I spent part of my time in French language training, because I would also be covering not only an Anglophone country, but French speaking. So to get that Francophone requirement, I took French again. So other things were preparing job descriptions for those that would go over. Particularly remember working up Gordon Robbins, who you may have interviewed already. But anyway, Gordon's, I didn't know what health educators, did basically, but he was a very bright, capable guy and helpful when trying to get that nailed down. But it was things like that, and cable traffic overseas, and different projects that would have to be done to keep things moving, because there was the Chrysler Corporation was putting on training program with the EIS folks were putting on training in virology and assessment and all of that.
Were you taking training and also trying to get organized with the people you had to help?
I did, but there were a lot of sessions in the training I didn't get in on, because these other things were felt to be more important. But we were all very busy. And at that time, my family, I think maybe there were 40 families holed up around here in different motels, including that one, Emory Inn or whatever it's called. But they were all over the Atlanta area. Well, I had this young child that I just adopted, the last one, and so my wife, Dorothy, we decided that we would leave her in Raleigh. And so Eastern Airlines was on a strike in 1966, so you had to resort to rail travel, which wasn't bad. I mean, there were 2 terminals in Atlanta, and if you missed a train on going into one, you could usually pick up Seaboard, Coastline, whatever, So there was one leaving from downtown Raleigh at about 10 o'clock on a Sunday night, and so I would take that 10 o'clock train out, and by the Emory station there was a restaurant for a while, but there used to be a little train station down at the foot of the hill on Clifton Road, where the tracks cross there. And so I'd ride the train all night and have breakfast on the train, and then I'd get off at the Emory station, walk up the hill, and go to work. Train came in there about, I don't know, 7:33 or something, so by 8 o'clock I was up the hill ready to go. Well, that worked fine for the summer when I couldn't use the airlines. But Dot stayed in Raleigh where she was more comfortable, and there were so many requirements on the part of the new adoption procedure that she had to be close by, or else she'd be doing a lot of travel. So basically that's how that occurred.
So were you the person then that was getting the complaints for the people who would be in your region in terms of get us over there, find us housing, help us get settled?
Those primarily got, depending on who initiated them, they went to Don Millar or they went to Billy Griggs for the most part. And the organization was not nailed into place at that time. And I made one quick trip over in the early or late summer, early fall, I guess more like early fall, to Lagos because we were having housing problems there. And Billy Griggs had gone over, and I don't know how he accomplished it so quickly, but he's a very gifted guy too when it comes to management. I say too, he's a very gifted guy. And so a lot of that was done, but here I was going to have to manage what was then determined to be a line position out to the field for equipment, supplies, money, bodies, all this kind of stuff. And so I lost my train of thought.
Well, I was just trying to establish all the different responsibilities.
Oh, where you mentioned about where the cable traffic came in, mainly to Billy Griggs on equipment and program operations, on the technical aspects of vaccine virology, and that went into probably Millar, but didn't matter who got it, everybody was together on it, you know.
Dealing with it. So when did you move to the Lagos office and stay there?
You know, I think it was sometime in the early part of November of 1966, because we wanted to get operational January the 1st of 67, and so much had to be done. When I first went over there, we were operating the regional office out of Muriel Roy's apartment, who lived nearby. Well, that didn't work very long, so my chief concern was getting into the building across from her and having a legitimate headquarters, you know, not working out of one's back pocket. So a lot of that early stuff went on and getting started.
Were you there ahead of the other folks who were going to come and implement?
Some got there ahead of me and were making do with contact with Atlanta and with the aid representatives, the AID, Agency for International Development, because this program was under their funding, you know. So
did you have to deal with them directly?
Oh, a lot.
What kinds of things did you interact with?
Well, all cable traffic came into them, so any communications you got came in through the embassy and directed through the AID people.
And I understand that you had to go through the European, if you were in a Anglophone country and wanted to cable a Francophone country or talk to one, you had to go through London.
We did it through the embassy, but they had selected ways. Even though I had a top priority clearance, it didn't make any difference when it got to talking about how those embassies communicated. And I got to be good friends with one of them, and he said, "Jim, I can't share anything with you on this order. I was asking some simple questions." He said, "Because that's just privileged information on need-to-know basis." So it was difficult oftentimes from one country to another to communicate, and it was easier with the embassy, it seemed like, to get a cable to Atlanta. Not always, because you go through the same procedures. And don't forget, for much of that time there, the Civil War was going on, and there were priorities that a lot of people felt were higher than what smallpox was doing. But the beautiful part of it, in spite of all that, the job got done.
The job got done. Would you talk a bit about the problems between, my understanding is that the regional office was originally conceived to do one thing, but there were some difficulties, and with Atlanta and AID and...
Okay, if you were to look at it, in one way professionally, as far as your job went, the greatest problem that Jim Hicks, saw there was communications followed by transportation. That were the two main problems that we faced.
Would you explain a little more?
Okay. Communications would lag. Sometimes they wouldn't go through. It was a very difficult. You had to make reservations for long-distance calls if you wanted to reach somebody with the normal telephone service, and that was very poor, and you'd get cut off. And they did a lot of rerouting through Europe and whatnot, I'm sure. All of that, I never paid much mind to it. I just knew that there was some lag time in getting through to Atlanta. And because the regional office in the beginning was looked on as here's headquarters, overall responsibility, and here is the regional office with almost lateral positions from these various disciplines in Atlanta to the regional office. And the regional office in the beginning, I think, was primarily designed to then push that out to all. But the communication was so bad, and people gradually would simply tie into who got them back the quickest answer. And if a guy is sitting in, I just use this for example, sitting in Dakar, Senegal, on the hump of furthest western part of West Africa, they could communicate to the States a lot easier than somebody buried up in Dahomey, maybe, or what later became Benin. But communication was a bad problem. That was the most serious problem to me. And when you have that kind of communication, things get misunderstood, and then they get what's the word I'm looking for? They get worse because of the difficulties in communication. So some out in the field, sitting in Guinea or somewhere, might feel, well, who is supposed to give me the information? The regional office, I don't get a response. Atlanta, maybe get a better response, so I'm just going to deal with Atlanta. Well, then that caused more problems, see? And then they caused bruised feelings. You know what saved all of that?
What?
Relationships established in that summer program here, and in people that came out of public health advisor programs who knew the players. And it's hard to get mad for long at somebody you care about. And obviously the people in Atlanta cared about us in Lagos. And we liked the people who cared about us in Atlanta. So even though these things came up, understandably, it wasn't disruptive in a serious kind of way. It was just one of those thorns you deal through,
And this was your most difficult professional problem?
For me, was communications. That might have been for operations officers in the actual countries. They would come up with something else. But for me, the most difficult thing was the communication out and transportation.
And tell me more about the transportation.
Well,
problem.
You had a Pan American flight from the States out a couple of times a week, maybe 3 times a week. But the other transportation by Mali Airlines and Ghana Airlines and these different local country airlines, they were concerned when they started flying, hey, we've got to get tied in with Paris if we're Francophone. We got to get tied in with London. We're going to get tied in with Europe, and a lot of the traffic was back and forth with expatriate help into these countries. So there was more concern to develop the airline system there, and sometimes you wondered whether they really cared a whole lot, whether they got some goats or tombstones or anything else from Dahomey to Lagos, or from the Cameroons to Gabon. You know, it just that inter-country travel didn't seem to have the attention on developing countries as getting tied in with European airlines and that kind. So I can remember more than once, but I remember one specifically. George Lithcott had to get back for a very important meeting, and he was somewhere, I don't remember whether it was Ouagadougou or Bamako, somewhere in the central part of West Africa, and he figured it up there. The only way he could get back was to fly to Madrid, and then from Madrid come back to Lagos. Well, he wasn't, you know, if he could have come across normally, and he could have, but it was much, much shorter to fly him to Europe and back down again. So it was stuff like that.
And did you have trouble moving supplies for the people in the field because of that too?
I'm sure they did, but so many of these supplies were offloaded. There were some that went out from WACAS, which was West Africa Consolidated Services or something that flew different things from the Lagos area. But primarily things were delivered by ship or air direct from the States and offloaded in the country of concern, you know.
You had a serious personal problem too that you had to deal with your son. Would you tell me about that?
Well, I have my oldest boy at the time was about 3 years old and approaching 4. And he had real severe asthma, and he'd been treated in Atlanta and at Duke University and different places. He had very severe asthma. And that was another thing. I'd get a waiver on him, a medical waiver on Jimmy, and a legal waiver on Stuart. All this added to my personal problems. But Jimmy, I had bad times of it there. In fact, in 1968, on a trip that Dave Sencer made over there, I guess he didn't want to really thought how I might react if he told me personally, and he could do it better writing. So he wrote a beautiful letter that just frankly told me, Jim, I think you're too close to the problem, because one time I was in Senegal, which is like a dagger in the heart of, the Gambia, which is like a dagger in the heart, they say, of the surrounding French area of Senegal. And I was in the Gambia, which is an English-speaking country. This little narrow thing just went along the Gambia River for a few miles on either side of it. Well, that's where I was, and I got this cable, and they said, come home immediately. Your son is in very serious condition. Well, I didn't, it could have been an automobile accident, could have been the war. I didn't know what it was. And things were different. There was no cell phone to pick up. There was no computer or internet. There was none of that. So it was try to get back as soon as you could. Well, as soon as you could, a day and a half or whatever it amounted to. And then I was fortunate to be able to do that. But anyway, I got back, and it was Jimmy, as I tried to put 2 and 2 together and think it was asthma because he had had these attacks. Yes, and he got very, very seriously ill a number of times. And to me, that the greatest problem of the West Africa program, are you talking about program-wise? Communications. Are you talking about personal problem? My son, Jimmy. Now, how did we solve them? The communications problem got solved to some extent just in time when you find ways to get around things. And you begin to say, hey, I must be misunderstanding this, because here we've gone this long and everything's working fine and progress is being made and all. So there was a lot of forgetting. There was a lot of overlooking. People in excitement may say one thing and you got to say, well, wait a minute. I know good and well he didn't mean that. So it was relationships established that took care of a lot of that. And ultimately, though, it created the demise of the regional office and changed it as it was intended, and it became more of a storehouse of knowledge and help in certain areas. And these people then could go out, and because we had a virologist there, a health educator, equipment specialist, and on. So Rafe was heavy into epidemiology and virology and all of that, as obviously as a medical officer. And George Lithcott had, bless his heart, he had to spend so much time with his enormous gift of diplomacy, of dealing with people, whether they were foreign nationals, expatriates, or our own people. He just, great deal of charisma, great deal of ability to deal with people. So that was a great help. You add all those things together, and though in the beginning, in 1967, in the beginning, things were troublesome. They worked themselves out to a certain degree, but not totally, because the way you got rid of the problem was essentially move a lot of the problem, or a lot of the intent of the regional office back to Atlanta.
I see. Okay. Were there any unique occurrences that you would like to talk about?
Oh, there were so many. The whole program was unique. You could just pick out almost any of them, but the best illustrations on those unique problems would have to come from the operations officer in the respective countries. Unique at the United States, well, we had one little hot time there when during the war, when a Fokker aircraft from Benin in the Midwest region was taken over by some mercenaries and Biafran sympathizers, because you had the East and you had the federal government in Lagos area, and that civil war going on. And one night, I don't know, about 1 o'clock in the morning, it seems to me like we heard this awful explosion. And this Fokker aircraft had been taken away from the Nigerian Airlines, flown to Biafra, and 5 mercenaries and 4 white mercenaries, European, that's the main part, I think, and 4 Africans came on a bombing run, and they came over Lagos, and we pretty much figured out they were on their way to Dogon Barracks, where the General Yakubu Gowon was, who was the head of the federal Nigerian government, and the Igbos over in the eastern section of the country were the ones that were doing the bombing. Well, find out that they had their bombs, however, were 55 or gallon drums or something in that neighborhood, and they were constructing Molotov cocktails of that size and just pushing them out the door of the plane. Well, it was later figured out, and I think they got 2 off, or there was some damage done, but it break primarily explosion and fire, you know. But the plane blew up midair, right, very, very close to the regional office, and so we found out the next morning, and it gradually got pieced together during the investigation, that they tried simply to use a different door, apparently in the back of the plane, to push one of these barrels out, and it was already lit, and it wouldn't go through. So the plane blew up midair, and they recovered 9 bodies, or the remains of 9, and 5 white mercenaries sympathetic to the Biafran cause, or paid by them or whatever. And so we look at it, and Muriel Roy, the secretary for the regional office, she got hit with flying glass, and she hadn't been wearing a kind of heavy bathrobe, I guess it was. She got hurt bad, and it blew out most of the windows in the regional office across the street, and some minor damage. But Yeah, they have little funny quirks to it too. Lagos at that time was getting off with black and white television. They had a little television station that wasn't very good and not very good for anything, but it was there and it was better than nothing. Well, it had an antenna, you know, that you saw on everybody's rooftop, and the explosion twisted her antenna such she started getting pretty darn good reception. So that might have been a unique situation.
You want to tell me this other?
Yeah, it's not of any real importance, but it's something that we've chuckled over, those of us who were there when it happened. We were on our way back from a conference, a regional conference in the OSEAC countries, which was in Yaoundé, Cameroon. And we'd had a successful time up there. This is very early in '67. And we were on our way back to Lagos, and we hit some turbulence outside of Lagos, several minutes or a little more than that maybe, as we were making a long approach into KJ Airport in Lagos. And they had taken meal trays, which they were just sitting in people's lap and giving them a sandwich or something. Well, all these trays were put on a rack normally for luggage, but it was an open rack like you find in buses and trains. And all these trays were stacked up there, but they weren't, we didn't know it at the time, they weren't tied down. Well, I'm in the seat underneath them. So when we hit coming in for the landing, and the plane did its normal wobble as it does in turbulence, the trays all came down. Well, they didn't come down on the floor, they came down on Jim's head. So they hit the top of my head and out I went. They told me later it was a French physician from Senegal on that aircraft who got up to see if he could do something to help me. So I later found out he undid my collar. I had a suit on with a tie, and he undid my trousers. Well, he went and sat back down because we were coming in for the landing. So I didn't know from anything. So when I got up, and everybody's still seated now because they're going to unload us from the front back. It was a small aircraft. But anyway, as I stood up, my pants dropped straight down around my ankles, and I stood there in my underwear in that plane, and that everybody on the plane chuckled and laughed, you know, about it. But anyway, that was unique to me. But
of course,
doesn't have any value to the West African program. But anyway, that's.
Well, in 1968, you came back to Atlanta and were named Chief of Operations of Area A, which was a 12-country area of West Africa. Now, tell me what that job was and how it was different from the regional office.
Okay, when we first went into Africa, we had, not in every country, but in most countries, in fact in Nigeria, it was divided into 4 regions, but there was a medical officer assigned to hit up the country, and he was assigned an operations officer to work with the onerous chores of keeping trucks going and all of the logistical support and things of that nature. Well, they got so heavily involved, and some of the medical officers had tremendous schedules of dealing with virology and assessment and surveillance and some of these things, that a lot of the things that the operations officer could do, he began to do as he was able to also train people to help with some of the equipment repair and pedijet repair. And one of the early on problems was axles. They broke all the time in those Dodge vehicles, those Dodge trucks. A lot of broken axles, and that was a real problem. So in the beginning there, with problems and communication and that enormous challenge that faced, I remember George Lithgott asking me in very early '67, we were, I forget where we were on that instant, but he asked me, he said, Jim, do you think we're going to eradicate smallpox? And I said, no, but I am grateful, as grateful can be, that you and I both, George, are going to have a shot at it. Because I said, I think we can reduce the morbidity such that we will save many, many lives. you know, when we went in about 66 or so, there were 40-something countries endemic with smallpox. 7 of them were in that West African program there. And at that time, there must have been, I would say 3.5 to 4 million people dying every year from smallpox. Well, if you've got that kind of problem and you reduce the morbidity so that 25% maybe of the morbidity doesn't become mortality, then you've made a big jump. And I was trying to get that point across to George. He readily knew what I was talking about.
Let me follow up on that. When did you finally feel that smallpox would be eradicated?
For me, it was in 1968. I'd say April, May of 68. And why do I say that? Because in January, just 13 months after we started, in January of 68 in Ghana, in Accra, we had a celebration of 25 million vaccinations. Well, now we're pumping out a lot of vaccinations. There's something like 105, 110 million people maybe in the overall area, and who knows? I mean, you know, the statistics are hard to come by with accuracy. But out of all that, 25 million in 13 months, like that. So I figured that, yeah, we're getting people vaccinated. But that wasn't really it. You see, to me, this whole program was a Gordian knot from the beginning. You had smallpox around for, what, 10, 15,000 years. I mean, and people dealt with it, and it would be clean for a little while, then there'd be another outbreak, and it went on and on. It was a Gordian knot. It was an unsolved, whatever the word is. You couldn't get it answered because you couldn't untie the knot. All right. Here's where the big change happened. Alexander the Great may have cut the Gordian knot that couldn't be untied with one fell swoop. I think we had 2 failed swoops, backed up by a lot of support. But I think the first one came from Bill Foege. Bill Foege was a principal architect of what we call eradication escalation, E² we called it. And that was presented, as I remembered, about May. And it was based on his early work in the Ogoja province over in eastern Nigeria before he had to leave when the war broke out. And it had to do with more identifying cases and then containment of those cases rather than just willy-nilly going across the country from one side to the other, vaccinating people. Okay, the idea of the eradication escalation, that when I saw what that meant to, or could mean to the total program, and then that was the first cut through the Gordian knot. The second one, Don Millar. Don Millar bought and understood it clearly from the very early conversation about it. But original ideas as principal architect wouldn't have gotten anywhere if Don Millar had not said, hey, we need to do this. As an adjunct of mass vaccination, we need to implement this. Well, that came out in April, May, something like that, at 68. Now, it was about that time, after I knew about E² and I saw what was happening in vaccinations going on in the area, that I made up my mind exactly right then. I did a flip-flop, and George Lithcott asked me, he said, Jim, you know, when I asked you this probably a year ago, how about if I asked you now? He said, what do you really feel about, now that we're in the program, been in it a little over a year, are we going to be able to eradicate it? And I said, I've done a complete flip-flop. That was my words. I've done a complete flip-flop, George. This disease can be eradicated, and I believed it. Now, a year before, I thought we'd bitten off more than we could chew, but that it was still very, very important to reduce that morbidity. So that's where I was coming from on that.
Beautifully said.
Can we cut right now?
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
I really just have a few more questions here. Are we rolling?
Yeah.
You when the West African program ended, you continued to work with smallpox eradication in the rest of the world. What special expertise did you see coming?
Okay, we need to back up a little bit because it was in '68, in the summer of '68, following the letter from Dave Sencer, which he wrote to me in Lagos while he was actually there, about Jimmy and his asthma. So I knew I wasn't fooling anybody, and I then began to realize seriously I may be putting my child at risk because medical care there was not super. So I had mentioned to Don Millar that I had to come back, and I would much prefer to continue on in the smallpox. Well, Henry Gelfand, who was had up at that time had taken these 12 countries in West Africa that he was responsible for from Atlanta in a line position, and then Bill Fagey had primarily Nigeria, and I forget, maybe some else, and he was Area B, and then Area C, Mike Lean had was the OSEAC area, over with Cameroon, Gabon, Chad, that area. So the long and short of it, I came back to play a role there. That pleased me immensely, but I still had direct operational opportunity to help these people in so many ways. And don't forget that these people now meant something to me. They meant a lot to the eradication of smallpox. But one of the greatest joys in this thing was working with people who were gifted and who cared about each other. And they cared about millions of people, each one of whom would never know any of those. Now that was important to me. So I wanted very much to stay put. And Don Millar, which I'm very, very grateful for, saw that I could do that job, and so he brought me into that. And this was one of those early examples of an operations officer, public health advisor type being able to step into a role formerly held by a medical officer, because it was management, and we could get things done through other people in management as effectively in one discipline as the other. So that's how I got into that. And then gradually, Bob Hogan soon after that came back, another operations officer, and now Lane and Fagey and could go on to other important things. One being director of the program itself, and later the other one the same thing. So we were able to then work in that way, and then we stayed on. We still had a tremendous amount of money being dumped into protecting the country with all of the risks. Now we got no deaths from smallpox. Well, we continue to have deaths from smallpox vaccination complications. So when you add all this together, we had to do something from an economic standpoint, from a humane standpoint, with doing something about what are we going to do as our domestic policy. So I got involved in some of that. Then the case manual was written. I forget what that stood for, and that'll come to me in a minute. But anyway, we had to go out and talk with state epidemiologists. It had to do with control procedures in a smallpox emergency, something like that. So that's how I stayed on with smallpox, and then I gradually from that went in as deputy director when it all got phased out, deputy director of nutrition, and from there into assistant director of management for the Center for Infectious Diseases under Walter Dowdle.
Coming back then, if you were going to do this program over, the small program, what would you change?
Well, this is unfair because to think of it, because if I were in the shoes of any of the principal players in 1966, I dare say I would have done it the same way. So in hindsight, I'm really doing Monday morning quarterbacking, and that's awful easy to do. But you have to consider that I lugged around something that probably weighed 20 pounds, which was an iron cranking calculator made by the Dutch, which if you push this lever down, would multiply and divide. But lugging that thing around, and you can get it to something that'll do a lot more than that for $3 at Walgreens or someplace. But in any event, the difficulties we had then, no computers, no cell phones, no emails, stuff. So I'd have done it the same way probably. But do it over again. If I was stepping in now and just facing the same problem, I would not have put the regional office in the plans. I would have had the people traveling from Atlanta and the same professional capacity that they could share with others being back here, and then drawing on that from here and sending them over or relating by emails, daily phones, whatever it had to be. But that's what I'd do differently. I would not have the regional office.
Once smallpox was eradicated in the world,
in 77.
You were awarded the Order of the Bifurcated Needle. Would you explain this for the record?
I wish I could totally. All I know, it came to me one day, but not to me alone now. I saw that some of the guys are wearing the little twisted bifurcated needle. It was, WHO was looking for something to let those who participated actively in the eradication of smallpox, something they could tie to as an award. And so I participated, but look at the hundreds and hundreds of others. So it was anything unique to me. I'd have been way down the line. There's so many others that received it with more input than I ever put into the program.
No, but I just think this is the neatest thing, because people give awards for military accomplishment, for various and sundry other things, and they may not understand the impact that people made with this little bifurcated needle in terms of contribution to humanity. So this
the bifurcated needle was a turning point into the total vaccinating procedure in the countries, where you could go train somebody in a hurry. There's no doubt that you had the right amount of vaccine between those forks, and when you put it into the arm, it took. And it was that was a great turning point, and the way to then keep smallpox out, and not to occur again. So it was a thrilling time. I'm thankful I had a part in it. Time will tell, but I certainly think enough time has passed by now to show the world that there's much learned in the smallpox program that can be applied to. I know with me personally it helped a great deal. I went on to do other things at CDC which required a lot more managerial skills than I had before I went into the program. But when you're thrown into the fire, so to speak, you learn rapidly. And I had the school I worked in, the people were just so dear to me even to this day. So
before we stop, is there anything else you'd like to add?
Oh, I've talked way too much. There's lots of people who can give you the other things that may be missing, but I appreciate the opportunity to share what I have shared, and I hope I've done it in a way that might be helpful.
I want to thank you very much. It has been just a super interview. Thank you for speaking.
Thank you, Victoria.